Hey folks, and welcome to iWizard. So today I'm going to be doing something a little bit special. I'm going to be ranking my favorite nonfiction books of all time. Thanks for watching and stay tuned. All right, welcome back. Jordan here. So I've been wanting to make this list for quite a while, and I have to tell you, narrowing it down and putting this thing together was totally agonizing. If you didn't know, I'm a huge nonfiction reader, and while I normally don't make reviews about nonfiction books, I'm really excited to share this one with you today. So I'm going to start with a few ground rules here just so there's no confusion. Okay, so rule number one, no works of classic philosophy. I'm going to eventually make a list of my all-time favorite philosophy books, and again, I just want that to be its own category so that I can make a great philosophy video for you guys. Rule number two, no repeat authors, much as I'd like to. And rule number three, I have to have read the whole book. So there are a ton of books like, Solzhenitsyn's Gulag Archipelago or de Tocqueville's Democracy in America that I've read chapters of or selected passages. But if I haven't read the whole thing, it's not going to be on this list. So oddly enough, that kind of means that there are quite a few nonfiction books that have been hugely influential to me that won't end up on this list, sadly. All right, so that's it. And we start with number 15, Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass. So this book is, of course, a memoir by the speaker, the author, the abolitionist, Frederick Douglass. It's about his upbringing as a plantation slave in Maryland, his education, his coming of age, and his eventual escape to freedom, first to New York and then eventually settling in Massachusetts. So the book is important for a number of reasons. On the one hand, it's valuable in the sense that it's an important historical document. It gives us a sense of what slavery was like in the early 19th century, what daily life was like, how the system worked, how slaves were sold, just the evils of the institution of slavery. And what's remarkable is that the book, in large part, is not about necessarily always what slavery does to the enslaved. I mean, it is, but even more so, it's about how slavery wrecks the souls and really twists the hearts of even the enslavers themselves, and how the institution essentially turns people who would otherwise be good into real demons. It also just so happens to be a rhetorical masterpiece. Douglass, when he was a city slave in Baltimore, actually taught himself his letters by getting a job at the shipyard and seeing letters written on the timber, like SA for starboard, aft, that sort of thing. And then he'd write those down, and once he'd learned enough letters, he would befriend these little street urchins, these white boys. And when his masters were running errands, he'd go up to these boys and challenge them, and he'd say that he was a better reader and that he knew more letters than them. And then when they tried to prove him wrong, he'd really pay attention. He even, for a while there, was trading his rations of bread to the boys in exchange for reading lessons. And so the book is just beautifully written, and it actually reads like a coming-of-age story. And the big moment of realization for him comes when he moves in with the Auld family in Baltimore. And Sophia Auld, she is the wife of the slave master. She's never owned a slave before, and so she really doesn't know the rules, and she gets scolded by her husband for trying to teach Frederick to read. And he basically says, listen, you can't teach these slaves to read because they're smart, and if you do, they'll learn really quickly and they'll become self-sufficient and they'll escape, and you wouldn't like that, would you? And so Douglass overhears this, and he's like, what? You said slavery wasn't wrong because we were inferior and subhuman, and now you're acknowledging that with education, I'll be just as smart as you. So why exactly do you get to enslave me? All right, up at number 14, we have The Age of Wonder by the British historian Richard Holmes. So, this book is about the second scientific revolution and the intrepid men and women whose discoveries at the end of the 18th century gave rise to the Romantic Age of science. And I'm telling you, the story that Holmes tells is one of the most exciting and absorbing accounts of history I have ever read, and I just can't get enough of it. I've read this book twice. So the book follows the stories of several figures. It starts with the British botanist Joseph Banks, who develops a passion for plants and then sails with Captain Cook to the South Pacific in search of new worlds. They end up, of course, discovering Tahiti. And so a large part of the book is about what they discover there in the South Pacific, how they get along with the natives, how Banks basically learns the language and becomes a sort of early ethnographer and anthropologist. We get the story, too, of the working class German astronomer, William Herschel, and his sister Caroline, who basically revolutionized astronomy and totally changed the way the telescopes were used. They built and pioneered some of the first giant reflector telescopes. Herschel, of course, discovered Uranus. The book also goes into the early balloonists who are experimenting with flight and risking their lives to take to the air. We get the story of Mungo Park, the Calvinist farm boy who explored the interior of Africa and tried to trace the Niger River. One of my favorite chapters, actually, of this book is the one on the chemist Humphrey Davy and his near-suicidal gas experiments. Davy, as you probably know, revolutionized chemistry. There are other figures in here too, but it's also about how these discoveries and inventions and the new knowledge that they brought about, how this was inspiring to poets and novelists and artists, and how this basically gave birth to the Romantic movement. So writers like Keats and Shelley and Coleridge, who would hear about these developments and write these works that changed how people thought about the world. All right, number 13, that would be At the Existentialist Cafe, Freedom, Being, and Apricot Cocktails by Sarah Bakewell. So I'm not entirely an existentialist, but I do teach the existentialists at work. And I find their ideas really fascinating, guys like Camus and Heidegger and Sartre. So if you're interested in that kind of thing, this book is about as good as it gets. What I like about it is that it's both a sweeping review of existential philosophy, the big ideas, the important debates, the great novels, but it's also a kind of group biography as well. Covering the relationships and the squabbles and the great loves and the artistic and political currents that shaped post-war thought. Very accessible, grippingly entertaining. Bakewell really takes you back to 20th century Europe, and it's like the title says, it's like you're sitting at some bar or cafe on the left bank in Paris, and you're rubbing elbows with some of these just fascinating characters who were dreaming up this new philosophy. This is the kind of book that is so readable and compellingly told that I really don't think you actually need to have much experience with these thinkers to really get into this. I'll say the only real drawback for me was that in the same way that I'm more of a fan of the old romantics, Wordsworth, Coleridge, Blake, Burns, that sort of thing, I'm also more of a fan of the older existentialists as well. So as I said, Kierkegaard, Nietzsche, guys like that. And so I guess I just wish there was a little bit more of that, but I fully understand why Bakewell did it this way, and I cannot recommend this book highly enough. Check it out. All right, so number 12, The Denial of Death by Ernest Becker. So I tend to like books that are chock full of big ideas and profound insights, and this is definitely one. So Denial of Death is all about how our fear of death is really at the core of everything we humans do, why we behave the way we behave. So the author's argument is that while denying death kind of is necessary for us to be able to function in the world, if we take it too far, this can lead to dire consequences. And we close off the possibility of important self-knowledge. It's also a really in-depth study on how different peoples and cultures have handled the concept of death throughout time. I like this book too because it works nicely just as a general intro to psychoanalysis. There's a lot of stuff on Freud and Kierkegaard and Otto Rank and the psychology of religion. So a few of the big ideas, Becker argues that there is a duality between the world of objects and biology on the one hand, and the symbolic world of human meaning on the other. And because of this duality between our physical and symbolic self, we try to transcend the dilemma of mortality by focusing on our symbolic selves. In other words, our culturally constructed frameworks of meaning, our social identities, and our self-esteem, which the author calls our heroism. He calls this symbolic self-focus our immortality project. An immortality project is a way for humans to basically live our lives in this symbolic realm where we subscribe to a set of culturally created meanings and we project these beyond our lifespan. And so by taking part in symbolic constructs that have more significance than and more longevity than our own bodies, this is how we gain a sense of legacy, or when it comes to religion, a sense of the afterlife. And we don't just feel like animals who die, right? So religion, spirituality, community, having children, building something, any productive accomplishment, these are all immortality projects. And the author says these are really the best way to manage death anxiety, is to take part in these rituals. On the other hand, when people use hedonic outlets like drugs or alcohol or entertainment to escape this death anxiety, which we all have, other people try to manage their terror of death by keeping themselves busy, by paying attention to trivial things, overloading their lives with frenetic activity to keep themselves essentially distracted. And so the author argues that the increase of these destructive behaviors that you see in society, this is a result of the decline of religions like Christianity that can, quote, take slaves, cripples, imbeciles, the simple and the mighty, and basically allow them all to accept their animal nature in the context of a spiritual reality and afterlife that is compelling. And so the loss of religion, the decline of traditional hero systems, as the author puts it, in an age of reason, that is going to leave humanity with impoverished resources for constructing the necessary illusions that you need to have in life, right? And while some people will try to argue that science can fill this role, that science can do the same thing that religion was once able to do, Becker argues that science just cannot do that because science is merely descriptive and it's incapable of providing agreeable, absolute meanings to human life. And in the end, the author says that we need new convincing illusions that enable us to feel heroic. All right, up at number 11, we have The Swerve, How the World Became Modern by Stephen Greenblatt. So this book is such a fun one, such a good example, too, of how an author can bring the past to life in a vivid way through storytelling, which is why the book won the National Book Award and the Pulitzer Prize. So The Swerve is about how one of the greatest books, which had been lost to history for over 1,000 years, this would be Lucretius's ancient poem De Rerum Natura, on the nature of things. The story is about how this ancient manuscript was saved from destruction and sort of plucked from the dustbin of history by the greatest book hunter of the Renaissance, Poggio Bracciolini, or Poggio Bracciolini, I'm not sure how to pronounce it, in the early 15th century. So this is basically a historical recounting of how when the Roman Empire fell and the Roman Catholic Church took over Europe, they suppressed all of the literature that didn't support the church and its views. And what that led to was these book hunters, in this case a priest, they would, out of curiosity or for money or just the joy of collecting, it's the story of how they would go on these road trips, basically monastery hopping around Europe, looking for these ancient pagan books that had been suppressed. And these monasteries were, at the time, the only place that had these books, the only place that had preserved these books and saved them. And so these book hunters had to sneak into these monasteries where the monks were the only ones who were allowed to see these books. And even they weren't allowed to study them. They had to copy them without really reading them, because these were like actually banned books. I know that term gets bandied around a lot these days. You know, an elementary or middle school library will stop stocking some book on its shelves, and the media will report that some totalitarian book ban has taken place, even though you can still buy all of those books everywhere at any store. But like, these were actually banned books that Greenblatt is writing about. They were books that the church wouldn't allow people to read because they were too subversive and blasphemous. And so it becomes like this Indiana Jones thriller where these book hunters are like sneaking into remote monasteries and finding books hidden in palimpsests and copying them out to preserve them. And there's court politics and ancient philosophy and monks studying in dark chambers in monastic scriptoria with book hunters plotting their next heist. And so that's what this is about. And the other thing here is that this particular Lucretius book, the book that is at the heart of this story, was a really dangerous one, which basically argued that the universe functions without the aid of gods, that religious fear is not good for us, that pleasure and virtue are not opposites, they're actually intertwined, that the world is made up of atoms in eternal motion which collide and swerve in new directions. And so I guess the message at the heart of this book is that the discovery of Lucretius's De Rerum Natura, its preservation and resurrection, it changed the course of history and made possible the rise of the modern world. And it's not just about book hunting and the whole Dan Brown kind of story, though this book does read like a Dan Brown novel. It's also about how Lucretius's vision came to shape the thought of Galileo and Freud and Darwin and Einstein and Thomas Jefferson. Anyhow, I love this book. And I know you guys will love it too, because honestly, it reads like a thrilling fantasy novel. All right, at number 10, we have Undaunted Courage, Meriwether Lewis, Thomas Jefferson, and the Opening of the American West by another Stephen Ambrose. So if you love, like me, reading American history, especially about the American West, and you haven't read this one yet, this is a fabulous, fabulous book. Undaunted Courage is kind of a biography of Meriwether Lewis, but it's really also an epic adventure story about the Louisiana Purchase, Thomas Jefferson's plan to find a waterway to the Pacific, the Lewis and Clark expedition, and that whole rugged, adventurous saga that ultimately led to Lewis's demise on the Natchez Trace. And what's cool is this is based on the journals and letters of Lewis and Clark and the Corps of Discovery, as well as Thomas Jefferson, who was obviously president at the time. So this isn't some dry biography. Ambrose does a great job giving a biography for Lewis and then a background for everything that happens leading up to the expedition itself, and actually tracing the expedition in detail. This is a big book, and so it traces the route they took, and there's all this description of the romantic American landscape with maps and illustrations drawn by Lewis himself, the interactions that these explorers have with Native Americans, and scientific discoveries and wildlife and all of that. And you get a lot about early Indian policy, the opening of the American West. And the thing I like here too is this is a swiftly moving narrative. I like when history is really like that, swiftly moving, not getting bogged down in too many details, and really trying to tell a thrilling story. So the history here is definitely rigorous, but it's told in a way that is cinematic. You have to You have to remember the journey these guys took, 28 months, 8,000 miles across what was largely unknown Western territory from St. Louis all the way to the Pacific Ocean and back again. And the story is so exciting. The portrait in here of Lewis is three-dimensional. You have to remember that young boys looked up to Lewis and Clark and the Corps of Discovery the same way that kids today tend to look up to astronauts. These guys, they were brave, and they really were the ultimate explorers. Anyhow, check this one out. It is awesome. Up next, we have The Story of Philosophy, The Lives and Opinions of the Greater Philosophers by Will Durant. So, yes, I did say that there weren't going to be any philosophy books on this list, but this book isn't so much philosophy as it is a history and genealogy of Western thought, starting with Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, moving all the way through the modern period and ending with the American pragmatists. So you guys might know Will Durant from his sweeping 11-volume history of Western civilization, The Story of Civilization, which he wrote with his wife Ariel. I have 3 volumes of that, and I definitely would like to collect them all someday. The Story of Philosophy, what else can I say? I'm suspecting that this will be a controversial pick among my listeners, my viewers. Many historians see Will Durant as an amateur, as someone who isn't a rigorous historian, but really someone who writes popular history. There are some volumes in The Story of Civilization that play fast and loose with the facts. Let me tell you then why this is one of my all-time favorite nonfiction books. I'm telling you guys, Will Durant's great strength is that he is a terrific writer. The prose is lively and energetic and witty. He's a superb storyteller. I mean, honestly, if you're someone who wants to learn about the great works of philosophy, but you don't feel like you have the time and energy to sit down and really slog through Descartes or Hume or Kant, maybe you lack the historical context to sit down and read Plato's Republic or Aristotle's Politics, right? If that's the case, this is definitely the book for you. Durant does a really good job of animating the history of philosophy and making you feel like you're going on an intellectual odyssey with these thinkers. And seriously, there aren't many authors of popular history who can write like this anymore. The prose is elegant and psychologically penetrating. Instead of saying, oh, Plato believed this and he believed that, instead of just summarizing the views of someone like Plato, he actually makes you feel like you're living in Plato's Republic, or that you're like Glaucon and you're in ancient Athens debating with Socrates. Durant is the rare writer who really can evoke that, where it's not just names and dates and dry summaries of ideas, but he really brings the philosophers and periods to life. Durant makes a very sincere attempt to understand the zeitgeist of each age that he's writing about. Another thing I truly appreciate, there's this belief that people have that a historian should be completely neutral and should never give his or her opinion and should try to just stay completely neutral. I don't really see the point in that. I see the point in being fair, and maybe if you're, a high school history teacher where you have a certain public responsibility to the taxpayers, I can see the point of neutrality there. But I actually like to hear an author's opinion. I like that Durant isn't afraid to make pointed judgments about the various philosophers he's covering. He accuses Schopenhauer, for example, of paying too little attention to the laughter of children, which is why he was such a gloomy pessimist. All right, speaking of historians who have the ability to take just mountains of documentary evidence and turn it into a gripping and readable story, we have The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich. So this is William Shearer's National Book Award winning chronicle of the rise and fall of Nazi Germany, starting with the birth of Hitler in 1889 to the end of World War II in 1945. This book was published in 1960, so just 15 years or so after the end of World War II. And it's an amazing book for several reasons. I'm going to stop holding this up because the book has a swastika on it. Firstly, what's impressive about this book is just the sheer depth and breadth of research that went into it. The book was sourced from Shearer's own daily diary as a war correspondent in Berlin and on the front lines of the war, which he eventually had to sneak out of Germany. He uses the captured private diaries of Nazi officials like Goebbels and Hitler's personal secretary, Martin Bormann. He had all the confidential archives of the German government that were stolen and secretly given to him. So this guy just had a mountain of research to work with from every branch of the government and military and even Himmler's secret police. And what's incredible is that this book is eminently readable. When I first picked this up, I just wanted to learn more about the rise of the Nazis. We all learn about this stuff in school. You read Night by Elie Wiesel, you read Maus by Art Spiegelman, and of course, being Jewish myself, I grew up certainly learning about the Holocaust from my family. My great-grandfather was a rabbi, and when you're a kid, we're all taught about the Nazi regime. You're really learning about it either in that traditional history class where you're learning about battles and dates and treaties, or you're learning about it in English, but you're learning about it from inside the concentration camp, which is very important, don't get me wrong. But as an adult, I remember I found myself just wanting to learn about how such a thing could happen, how the guy with the little mustache rose to power, how the Nazi Party was formed, what exactly was the party ideology, and what sources were they drawing from? What did utopia look like to them? What did Gleichschaltung actually look like in practice? Like, how did the regime Nazify Germany so quickly? How did the party change as it grew? What was education like? The Hitler Youth, I always found that to be really disturbing and fascinating. How did that work, right? And so I was curious about that. And so when I asked around, really everyone recommended that I read this book. My history teacher colleagues, my history buff friends, and I actually really thought this was going to be a dry affair. I assumed, if you take a look at this doorstopper of a book, I figured it was just going to be a slog. Honestly, I have to say, in all of its horror and unsettling reality, this book was actually a page-turner. It was very gripping, much like a car crash, right? The book is simultaneously disturbing, but also, once you start reading, you just feel like you can't look away. The writing is unbelievably good. Shearer was a masterful storyteller, and part of this was that the guy was actually a journalist and not a real historian. So he knew how to wield facts, but also how to weave those facts into a narrative that makes readers want to keep turning the pages. I also like the fact that because this book was written in 1960, it really is free of the kind of virtue signaling that is near ubiquitous today. It's like, we know the mustache guy was a bad man. He's an evil monster. We know. You don't have to hit me over the head with it. I'm trying to learn about history. Not that there isn't plenty of condemnation in here. There is, but it's done in a way that is mature and that treats readers like adults. And so I can't recommend this book highly enough. All right, up at number 7, we have A History of the American People. So this is the British author Paul Johnson's magnum opus. And this is, in my opinion, just the hands down best full history of the United States that so far anyone has produced. Though recently, this book, Land of Hope by Wilfred Maclay, does come close, though this is more of a textbook for students, whereas Johnson's book is really meant to be an accessible, popular history, and really a corrective to Howard Zinn's People's History of the United States, which is just like a resentful harangue against America, rife with inaccuracies. I'll say this for Howard Zinn. Zinn is a good storyteller, and there's a reason his book has been so influential. In fact, I even have a copy that I keep on my shelf. That said, it's super unbalanced and really makes no attempt to see the good in America. And so I'll say that Paul Johnson really is the anti-Howard Zinn. At the very end of this ginormous book, Johnson says, for example, that, quote, "The story of America is essentially one of difficulties being overcome by intelligence and skill, by faith and strength of purpose, by courage and persistence. America," he says, "is a human achievement without parallel." So I'm not saying that Johnson does not have his critiques of America. He's not shying away from our past evils. He doesn't try to whitewash history or anything like that. But this is ultimately a story of hope and triumph and shared progress despite America's imperfections. But I'll say this too, that one of the reasons I love this book is it's written by an outsider. It's written by like the most British man you can possibly imagine. But because of that, I feel like he's able to see America more clearly in some ways. He's able to see the forest from the trees, which is useful when you're trying to make sense of 400 years of American history, going back to well before the American Revolution. Another thing I appreciate is that even though this book really does try to be somewhat balanced, it's not unbiased, nor does it pretend to be. And there's also no lack of personality here. So if you read this, you're going to come across so many arresting contentions and just pieces of fascinating, oddball information sprinkled throughout. And so this is just a blast to read from the colonial and revolutionary periods through to the 19th century, which seems to have been Johnson's favorite period. I just love the way he describes America. I'm going to read you a quote here. He describes America as a country, quote, "specifically created for ordinary men and women with a system of government deliberately designed to interfere in their lives as little as possible." He calls America a land of, quote, "obstinate individualism and a do-it-yourself society that worked." But I think just easily my favorite aspect of this book is Johnson's colorful and very vivid character descriptions of everyone from the founding fathers to Walt Whitman and Lincoln to tycoons and industrialists. They're really closer to like little mini biographies, and they can be pretty acerbic at times too, from his scathing criticisms of progressive era characters like Woodrow Wilson and Herbert Hoover and FDR to later presidents like JFK and LBJ. He definitely can get a bit saucy, right? So it's not all just, everything is positive and hunky-dory. He calls JFK, quote, "one of the biggest frauds in American political history," and LBJ, he says, "had a real dark side." Anyway, such a great book written by such a keen and capacious mind, composed in a style that is sweeping and witty and felicitous. Anyhow, next up we have number 6, The Cave and the Light, Plato versus Aristotle and the Struggle for the Soul of Western Civilization. And this is by Arthur Herman, Pulitzer Prize-winning author. So this book is about the philosophers Plato and Aristotle, obviously, and how these two monumental figures basically laid the foundations of Western culture and authored the sort of rival intellectual paradigms that we still live by today, Aristotle being the father of modern science, logic, technology, while Plato becomes the muse of all that is transcendental, the theologian, the mystic, the poet, and the artist. You can actually see it here on the cover of the book. This is the centerpiece of Raphael's Sanza della Senatura, and this painting obviously is called The School of Athens. This one's kind of zoomed in, but I'll give you a better image here. You can see here that in the center, the focal point of the painting, you have Plato on the left walking with Aristotle on the right, and they're both arguing over philosophy. Plato, you can see, is holding the Timaeus, which was a favorite dialogue of mystics and artists and religious philosophers and occultists. You can also see that Plato is pointing to the heavens in a gesture that seems to say, "This way is truth." And on the other side, you have Aristotle, man of logic and science and practical reason, and he is holding the Nicomachean Ethics. And if you look at his hand, he's clearly making a gesture that looks like it's tempering Plato's impulse to look toward the heavens and the divine and the transcendent realm of perfect forms. So Plato is pointing to the sky while Aristotle is holding his palm down. So we have mysticism versus common sense, religion versus science, empiricism versus idealism represented in this paradigm. And that's what this book is all about. Over the years, Herman argues that this eventually becomes Romanticism versus the Enlightenment, Burke versus the French philosophers, Rousseau versus Locke. As Samuel Taylor Coleridge once said, quote, "Every person is born either a Platonist or an Aristotelian." I should also mention, as an aside, that Socrates was Plato's teacher, Plato was Aristotle's teacher, and Aristotle was Alexander the Great's teacher. Anyways, this book is just loaded with mind-blowing facts and stories, and in some sense, it reads like a tour of Western culture. If you think you're just going to be reading about these two ancient Greek philosophers here, you would be wrong. You not only get their life stories, the two of them, you probably know this, set up rival academies in ancient Athens, but this book is also about how their ideas carried on to shape the Middle Ages and the Renaissance all the way up to the present day. All right, up next we have number 5, Sexual Personae, Art and Decadence, from Nefertiti to Emily Dickinson from 1990. So this is Camille Paglia's sweeping over 700-page long tome. It's been called, quote, "nothing less than a unified field theory of Western culture." Paglia herself says in the beginning of the book that this book was, quote, "intended to please no one and to offend everyone." And that is definitely accurate here. There is certainly something in here to offend everyone, whether you're a liberal or a conservative, a feminist or a traditionalist, whether you're a modernist or a postmodernist, a Christian or a pagan. From all corners, you're going to hear the cries of blasphemy. Paglia was absolutely a firebrand, though I was surprised to learn recently that this was one of David Bowie's favorite books. So the book is kind of a psychoanalytic examination of sexual decadence and sexual difference in Western literature, in Western art, in Western religion, but it's also an exploration of what Paglia sees as the primary conflict in Western culture between the Apollonian and Dionysian forces. Apollo, if you know anything about Greek mythology, being associated with order, symmetry, rationality, civilization, and Dionysus with disorder and chaos and emotion and nature. So she's definitely operating here within that Nietzschean tradition. But anyway, one thing I love about this book is that Paglia actually outlines the different sexual personae or archetypes and then links them to actual characters from myths and literature and cultural figures. The female vampire is Medusa and Lauren Bacall. The Pythoness is the Delphic Oracle and Gracie Allen. The beautiful boy is Hadrian's Antinous and Dorian Gray. The Epicene man of beauty is Byron, Lord Byron and Elvis Presley, etc. There's also a treatment in here of so many of the great Western artists and writers, everyone from Donatello, Botticelli, Da Vinci, Spencer, Shakespeare, Goethe, Coleridge, Emily Bronte's, D.H. Lawrence, Oscar Wilde. And again, there's just no way I could list them all or condense her argument down and summarize the whole thing for this video. I guess I'll just give you a taste of some of the controversial claims she makes in this book. And if they whet your appetite, maybe you'll go and buy the book. So here's a list, a very brief list. Paglia argues that Christianity did not destroy paganism, which now flourishes in art and popular culture. The major patterns of continuity in Western culture, in fact, she says, originate in paganism. She says an artist's greatest motivation is to make nature's madness coherent using the alchemy of his work. She says art arises from the, quote, deranged egotism and orderliness of the male mind. She says most criminals and geniuses are men because both crime and art involve imposing one's personal masculine will on the world. She writes, quote, there is no female Mozart because there is no female Jack the Ripper. She says that Western culture is a struggle between phallic sky religion, sky cult on the one hand, and chthonic earth religion, earth cult, on the other. And so that just gives you a good sense of what you'll be dealing with if you get into Sexual Personae by the great, she calls herself a feminist philosopher, Camille Paglia. All right, number 4, that brings us to number 4, which would be the closing of the American mind, how education has failed democracy and impoverished the souls of today's students. This is another controversial book. I actually really love controversial books, if you can't tell. Though as recently as 10 years ago, this was on College Board's list of recommended AP language books. So Closing of the American Mind is Alan Bloom's 1987 cri de coeur about the collapse of higher education. It's kind of a diagnosis of what happened to the universities, how they lost their way, declining standards and expectations, the depersonalized and uninspiring learning environments, grade inflation, the introduction of shallow new disciplines in the academy that really rest on a foundation of nothing but identity politics and teach students how to be resentful and weak and petulant. Certainly, Bloom talks at length about the leftward drift of our prestige universities, but the book overall is really about how adults have failed young people and set them adrift, both intellectually and morally. And I'll say that while Bloom definitely can be a crank at times, he was a University of Chicago professor, and so his assessments always have more than a grain of truth to them. Bloom begins the Closing of the American Mind by taking stock of young students today. He finds in them a deficiency in moral formation, in their reading of serious books, in their musical taste, and above all, in eros. He says they have no love in their souls, no longing for anything high or great. According to Bloom, he says their minds are empty, their characters are weak, and more than anything, and I personally have observed this to be completely and totally true, that these students have somehow been possessed by a deep moral and epistemological relativism that attempts to close off all discussion with the simplistic rejoinder of, who's to say what's right and wrong? You know, the truth, after all, is relative. And so that's kind of the point of this book. That's the main philosophical thing that Bloom is grappling with. And so what the adults have done, according to Bloom, is they have acquiesced. Instead of pushing back, instead of setting students on a challenging course through the humanities to discover enduring truths, these students have been indoctrinated to believe that essentially searching for truths is futile because truth doesn't exist. And so the consequence of this relativism, Bloom argues, is just an easygoing openness to everything, which in turn leads to an incapacity for being serious or deeply knowledgeable about anything. Their openness turns into a dogmatic closedness toward moral virtue and real thoughtfulness. And Bloom argues that all of this leads to a kind of frozenness, an incapacity for making important judgments and discriminations. Notice that in our times, both the words judgment and discrimination, the latter of which just means to choose one thing over another, both of these words have taken on extremely negative connotations. Bloom's argument in this book, in other words, is that American students are steeped in a paradoxical relativism that, in the name of openness, actually closes off the intellect to enduring standards and a genuine grappling with what makes for the good life. And the thing is that this grappling is deeply necessary because some things really are better than others. We don't live in a relativistic world. Some things are better for human beings than other things. He says, quote, "The modern university does its best to knock down every prejudice of its students, yet it replaces them with nothing." So there's a lot there, I know, but what I really love about this book is that it's not just an endless, curmudgeonly screed shouting at kids to get off his lawn. By the way, Alan Bloom was anything but a curmudgeon. He was a conservative for sure in the sort of zetetic Straussian tradition, but he was also an eccentric, chain-smoking, gay, cosmopolitan aesthete who spent all of his money on fancy clothes and shoes, and whose crowning achievement was a magnificent translation of Plato's Republic. And I would say, too, that this book isn't just a polemic against the young. It's also a panegyric about what a liberal arts education can and should be. The author argues essentially for a return of the tradition of the liberal arts education that harnesses the best of what has been thought and known, as Matthew Arnold puts it, of developing the higher faculties, which include judgment and taste and civic virtue, that collection of qualities that Cicero called humanitas. And if you're a philosophy person, you'll love that this book is full of references to Plato and Nietzsche and de Tocqueville and Hegel and Kant and the American founders. Truly a modern classic. Okay, up at number 3, we have Carl Trueman's The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self, Cultural Amnesia, Expressive Individualism, and the Road to Sexual Revolution. So I know this title is a mouthful, but this book is actually probably the most recently published book on this list. It's essentially about what the Romantic movement ultimately did to our culture in the West, how the Romantic expressivism of the 18th and early 19th centuries gave rise to a new sense of selfhood, and how that sort of happened right under our noses without us ever really even realizing it. So this book is basically a study of how the definition of personhood changed and how we now see inner subjectivity, how the individual feels inside as definitive of the person, and how we now see people as sort of psychosexual Gnostic beings that are no longer tethered to external authority or, for that matter, anything beyond personal psychological conviction. And so the story Trueman tells is all about the consequences that has had. Trueman basically says that this is where we get modern gender theory and all these different gender identities. And I won't go there because I really don't want this video to get demonetized. But I just can't tell you how revolutionary and transformative this book was for me. It changed the way I think about nearly everything. What I love is that this is a slow and careful intellectual genealogy of the transvaluation of Western values that eventually led to the sexual revolution in the West, really starting with Rousseau, who is the grandfather of Romanticism, all the way through Marx, Nietzsche, Freud, the Frankfurt School, and beyond. So just a summary, the author argues that the big change in the Western world came with the rise of a new type of person that has become emblematic of our age, the therapeutic man. Whereas men of the past sought meaning in outwardly directed communal activities, and I'll quote Trueman here. He says, "The ancient Athenian was committed to the assembly, the medieval Christian to his church, and the 20th century factory worker to his trade union and working man's club." But he basically argues that once we get the arrival of the therapeutic man, this relationship is inverted. For the modern psychological man, the search for meaning and fulfillment is turned inward, and, quote, "Outward institutions become the servants of the individual and her sense of inner well-being." The purpose of therapy thus shifts its original purpose of socializing the individual to its modern variant, which seeks to protect the individual from the kind of harmful neuroses that society itself creates through its smothering of the individual's ability to simply be herself. But the key shift at the heart of this book that Truman talks about happened when Western culture shifted from a mimetic to a poetic view of the world. So a mimetic framework is one in which nature has an established order and meaning, and our job is to uncover this meaning and conform to it. A poetic framework, conversely, is one in which the world around us is just chaos and raw stuff. It's inherently meaningless. It has no built-in teleology. Our job then is to make something of this raw stuff and create our own meaning. So a mimetic worldview says we have to conform to the world and its natural laws and its roles. We have to adjust ourselves to reality. Institutions exist to shape and mold people and make them better. Whereas a poetic worldview says that the world must conform to me and my inner sense of myself. It must affirm me and who I think that I am inside. So this is where we get the politics of recognition. It's no longer I think, therefore I am. It's I feel, therefore you must recognize me. A poetic worldview says that institutions should conform to idiosyncratic individuals and essentially bend over backwards for them. That the institutions I'm part of should shift and contort themselves to meet my inner psychological needs, my school, my workplace, my church. It should change its values, its standards, and its norms for me. So this is what the West has slowly become since the Romantic period. Institutions have become platforms for expressive individualism. If I'm the one kid in class who's offended by the book my teacher's teaching, the curriculum should be changed for me. Anyways, that's kind of the gist of it. This book was life-changing, earth-shattering for me, and I would highly recommend it. All right, next up at number 2, we have the great economist Thomas Sowell and his Basic Economics. So this is the 5th edition. When this book was first written, it was like this, and over the years it has expanded and expanded and expanded. You can see all of these wonderful recommendations. Thomas Sowell, if you didn't know, is one of the greatest thinkers who has ever lived, the great economist who is at this point 93 or 94, and he is still sharp as a tack and writing books. You see interviews with him all the time. Basic Economics was essentially my introduction to economics. I think I read Economics in One Lesson by Henry Hazlitt, and then it was Basic Economics by Thomas Sowell. So the distinguishing feature of this book is that, and he says this right here in the introduction, that Basic Economics has no graphs and no equations. It is written in plain English rather than economic jargon. It is not even written like a textbook. Thomas Sowell just goes through chapter by chapter. And again, I wish I could tell you something profound about this book, but the problem is that this is essentially a massive tome about every economic principle you can possibly think of. Starting with what is economics to the role of prices, where prices come from and how they're set by supply and demand, price controls and how price fixing doesn't work, the rise and fall of businesses, the role of profits and losses, the economics of big businesses, so brands and things like that, regulation and antitrust laws and the unintended consequences there, market and non-market economies, which is very interesting, productivity and pay, minimum wage laws, special problems in labor markets, investments, stocks, bonds, insurance, everything you could think of from practical economics to the kind of theoretical Austrian stuff, supply side economics, subjective theory of value, why the labor theory of value is wrong, scarcity, all that stuff, national output, money in the banking system, government functions, government finances, special problems in the national economy, trade, transfers of wealth, disparities, myths about markets, non-economic values, the history of economics. And it's just, this book is chock full of difficult economic laws and theorems and ideas explained at the level that an 11th grader in high school could understand. It's indispensable reading from truly one of the greats. I mean, I may at some point just review this entire book and just go chapter by chapter through it and kind of highlight the main arguments and ideas in each chapter. That is something that probably will happen in the near future. So Basic Economics, a common sense guide to the economy, written in beautiful, elegant, simple, easy to understand, accessible prose, and you really should pick it up. All right, taking up the number one slot on this list, my favorite nonfiction book, this would be The Righteous Mind by the social psychologist Jonathan Haidt. That's The Righteous Mind, Why Good People Are Divided by Politics and Religion. So this is an eye-opening and ambitious, best-selling book. The New York Times Book Review calls this a landmark contribution to humanity's understanding of itself. And the central question here is, why do we fight? Why can't good people get along? Why are we constantly arguing over things like politics and religion? Why are we so polarized? What is it that makes us believe what we believe? Why do we disagree with one another? Not when it comes to math so much, or not when it comes to these really basic things that are not controversial, but how come the moment the topic of conversation drifts into politics or religion, why is it that we can't seem to get along? Why are we so polarized? And of course, this book is more relevant now than ever. And this is a deep dive in psychology and anthropology. There's absolutely no way I could give you Haidt's full argument, but what I will say is the reason that this is a landmark book is that Haidt introduces an important theory that is backed by a lot of research called moral foundations theory. And that's the idea that we essentially decide what we believe. Again, we tend to think that we're rational, and that when we're asked a question about what we believe, we really think through it. We do our research. We use our rational faculties. Haidt says that is not true. Based on all available research, what we really do is we decide what we believe about pretty much everything that's controversial at a gut level using our intuition. We decide instantly and intuitively what we believe. Ask someone about how they feel about the death penalty or abortion. And we tend to think that we're really rational about why we believe what we believe, but really we're just going with our gut. And then we do use our reason, but we use our reason when our gut level intuitions are challenged. So we decide something, we go with our gut, and then someone challenges us, and then we engage in post hoc rationalization. We reason after the fact. We use our reason like a PR person or a lawyer to defend our pre-rational gut level intuitions, and then we start reasoning. We say, the reason I believe that is, and then we think up as many reasons as we can as to why our gut told us we thought X, Y, or Z on that particular topic. We are righteous creatures, and actually a good deal of why we believe what we believe is not only environmental and social and a product of nurture, but it's a product of nature as well. We are quite literally born to believe in certain things, to have a certain type of personality trait that leads us to believe, to support one political worldview versus another, to be a religious believer or not. Haidt argues that there are taste buds of the righteous mind, that our minds are like audio equalizers. And let me remind myself of the 5 taste buds of the righteous mind. There is care, there's fairness, there's loyalty, there's authority, and there's sanctity. So his argument in this book is essentially that liberals, people who identify as liberal, have a foundation or 2-channel morality. Their morality is based on care for the vulnerable, and fairness, usually fairness as equality of opportunity or equality of outcome. Whereas conservatives, they're also high in care and fairness, but they also have other moral foundations that liberals don't see as morality. So conservatives have care, fairness. They also have loyalty as an important moral value. They have authority, deference to authority, and a belief that hierarchy and authority is a good thing, and sanctity, meaning purity and keeping yourself clean and keeping the body politic clean, and that sort of thing. And so liberals tend to see these latter three values as not being a product of genuine righteous morality, whereas conservatives tend to think that liberals have too narrow of a moral palette. And so anyways, this is a great book. I actually teach this book at school. My AP seniors find this book endlessly fascinating. It gives rise to all sorts of interesting conundrums and debates. They love the just so stories and the harmless taboo violation stories. And there's just so much great stuff in this book. All right, so that's going to be it. Thanks for watching. In the comments section below, feel free to tell me what your opinions are, what I've missed, your favorite, top favorite nonfiction books. And until next time, happy reading. Thanks for watching.